The Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project presents Old Colorado Apples, an introduction to the remarkable apple varieties that were historically grown in Colorado. This class is made possible by an educational grant through History Colorado and the State Historic Fund, and the generous support of MORP members. The Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project works to preserve Colorado's fruit-growing heritage and restore an orchard culture and economy to the Southwest region. It was apples and not peaches that established the Colorado fruit industry. Orchards, mostly apple, were planted along the Front Range from the Wyoming border to the New Mexico state line. Though mocked for believing that fruit could be grown at these altitudes, the growers persisted. They aggressively experimented, planting hundreds of varieties of apples that were available to them in what would be known as the golden age of American fruit diversity. Some of these cultivars are still grown today. Others, like the Walbridge, are now considered extinct. Here's a premium list from the 1915 Montezuma County Fair showing what they expected to see at the fair. Among these varieties are the new and popular Delicious, but there's also the Walbridge, McMahon White, and other rare varieties. The diversity of the apple cultivars and orchards represents not only different flavors and textures, but also different seasons of ripening. This was especially important because it allowed family labor to harvest, process, and market their fruit over a longer period of time to the growing population of Colorado's cities, towns, and mining camps. There were two extensive surveys of Colorado orchards, including the varieties that were being grown. They are opposite plates of a hinge. In 1891, Dr. Charles Crandall celebrated the diversity of fruits found in orchards at that time in Colorado, often 20 or more varieties per orchard. By 1920, Dr. E.P. Sandston considered the diversity a burden when he surveyed the orchards of Colorado, considering 3 to 4 types of apples plenty in any commercial orchard. All of the names of all of the varieties of apples that were once grown in Colorado have been assembled by MORP into the Old Colorado Apple database. Half of the apples on this list are now considered extinct. If any of these cultivars still exist, they are likely hiding in plain sight, an old tree in a suburban backyard, or a historic orchard in rural Colorado, visible but forgotten. Documenting what was grown in our state may be our only clue in identifying and giving a name to the historic trees across Colorado. MORP was able to submit leaf samples from nearly 500 different trees for DNA analysis. Of those samples, 68 came back as named cultivars: the Delicious and the Ben Davis, the Grimes Golden, American Summer Pearmain, and Primate, among others. 31 of these samples matched other samples. They were trees that matched other trees, but their name was unknown because there was no control for them in the DNA bank, which meant that there was no tree in the repositories that matched them. Nearly 100 of these samples came back as unique unknown. That means there is no other known tree of this type. Out of the nearly 500 samples, there were almost 200 different cultivars that were identified through this DNA testing, showing the diversity that still exists in Colorado's old orchards. Here's an orchard view from the historic Welty Orchard down in Weber Canyon, south of Mancos. This was an old Mormon orchard planted sometime in the late 1800s to early 1900s. There's the new apples of the day, the Senator and the Delicious, but then there's also the old American Summer Pearmain, the red Astrakhan from Russia, the white winter pearmain. There are also multiple of these other apples that matched other trees. Sometimes it was another tree in the orchard that matched. Sometimes it was a tree in the middle of Wyoming or Yosemite National Park. But this highlights the diversity that was found in these oldest of orchards. One of the apples that we found down there in Weber Canyon was the Missouri pippin. We had known about the Missouri pippin from reading about it in the earliest reports of orchard planting in Colorado along the Front Range. It was a favorite with these growers because it bore fruit at a young age, heavy crops of attractive fruits that were tasty. It could not have hurt that the Missouri pippin was also from Missouri, the origin of many of the wagon trains leading to Colorado. This is the historic Buchanan Orchard in the Hermosa Creek drainage north of Durango. The house was built in the late 1880s, and we can assume that the trees were planted about the same time. What's significant is it shows how a time period affects what trees are in the orchard. During this time of great diversity in this orchard, we see unusual varieties like sweet bow and maiden blush and Wagner, though they were better known at the time they were planted. There's also multiple types of apples in this orchard that are unknown. Sometimes they match other trees, whether in the same orchard or in the same area. Sometimes they don't match any known cultivars out there. Often in these old orchards, we will start recognizing the same apple, seeing it from tree to tree in different locations. Even though we may not know the name, we can tell that it's the same tree that we saw over there or over there. This was the case of the Wagner. This is a dark red, hard-ribbed, angular apple that is oblate, meaning it is wider than it is tall. It's a high-quality apple, and we knew it had to be something, so we took samples of this from the orchards, brought them home, and cut them up and started comparing the slices of the apples, the cross-sections, to pictures of cross-sections of Wagner's in historic books. This is how the old-fashioned way of identifying apples exists. Sometimes apples can develop a local name. This was the case of the summer snow, an old tree from the historic gold medal orchard in McElmo Canyon. This was called the summer snow because Miss Vivian Kenyon, who was born across the road from this tree, called it the summer snow. Miss Vivian called it the summer snow because her grandmother, Mrs. Duncan, called it the summer snow. We had never heard of an apple called the summer snow before, didn't know it existed, and could not find any record of it. When we did DNA of this tree, it actually came back as a Whitney crab. Sometimes we wind up giving names to old varieties of apples. This was an apple growing in Sarah Miller's orchard in the Mormon communities south of Mancos. The apple has beautiful dots all over it, so we called the apple Sarah's polka dot. After we were able to get DNA testing on it, it came back as an American summer pearmain. A fairly rare variety of apple now, the American summer pearmain goes back to the early 1800s in America, though its origin is somewhat unknown. A better-known variety of summer apple is the Shenango strawberry, originally from New York. The Shenango strawberry was popular both because it bore fruit in August, a great benefit for both home orchard and commercial orchards, but also because of its hardiness. The Shenango strawberry, with its oblong, taller than it is wide shape, is often confused with another apple and sometimes get a second name, the strawberry delicious. In the 1870s, the USDA started sending out artists, mostly women, to paint apples across America. This became the USDA Pomological Watercolor Collection, a tremendous resource for us in identifying apples. We knew from county fair records that the summer Rambo was grown in Montezuma County. We could find the color plate of the from the pomological collection of the summer Rambo, so that when we were able to find a tree with fruit on it in the summer with large apples that were green overstriped with red, we were able to feel comfortable with our match of this as a summer Rambo. which was later confirmed by DNA. Wealthy is an apple that was commonly grown in Colorado. This was Peter Gideon's apple from Minnesota, which launched the Minnesota plant breeding program. It was grown in Colorado because it was considered an ironclad, very, very cold hardy. Wealthies were common to see grown in Colorado, and we still see some of them around. The identification of a wealthy can be difficult because it's a round red apple, and round red apples all look remarkably similar, at least at a glance. Another old apple that we see growing quite a bit around was the winter banana. This was a seedling from Indiana in the 1870s that then went into production in a nursery in Ohio in the 1880s and then made it to Colorado by the 1890s. This is a beautiful yellow apple turning golden. It's a perfect balance between sweet and acidity. It was also planted because it was a great pollinator for other varieties of apples. There's three apples that we see written about in Colorado history and in national history: the Gano, the Black Ben Davis, and the Ben Davis. Sam Dunning here told us he knew this was a Gano apple tree because he had lived there all his life, and of course he knew it was a Gano. There has always been a lot of debate whether the Gano and the Black Ben were the same apple or not, or the Gano and the Ben Davis were the same apple or not. When we did our DNA testing on Ganos and Black Ben Davis and Ben Davis, all of them came back as Ben Davis. This doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't different apples if they were spurs. In other words, if a single limb was different from the rest of the tree, it could still be a different variety, but DNA-wise be too closely related to the Ben Davis to be able to be recognized as different. It's a mystery we don't know. The Ben Davis was the main crop apple, much like the Delicious was before the Delicious came around, especially in the South. It never was considered a great northern apple, but in Colorado, it actually got named the Colorado Beauty due to its high quality and as a way of distinguishing it from the Ben Davis, which had a worse reputation at the time. About the same time Stark Brothers released the Delicious, they also released an apple that was originally called Oliver, and Stark Brothers bought the rights to it and renamed it the Senator. This is a round apple with beautiful small russeted dots on it. This apple was sort of on the timeline between what was and what was about to happen. When this variety came out, people were still planting very diverse orchards, but there was a movement towards getting rid of a lot of these varieties. Unfortunately for the Senator, in spite of its exceptional flavor, it fell on the wrong side of the line and has now become a rare apple to find. It must be remembered that before 1898, all apple varieties came from chance seedlings, a tree growing in the woods or along a fence or along a road. Across Colorado, many great old seedlings still exist, and it's always worth taking the time to get out and look at these trees and taste the apples. Sometimes the next great apple will be among them. Here's Purple Mountain Majesty, a rootstock in an orchard where the graft had failed, but because it was in row, the rootstock was allowed to grow, and it put out these beautiful purple apples. Here's a tree along a fence line called Six Finger Jack, growing near Six Finger Jack's cabin in Montezuma County. This is a big, blocky, high sugary apple. Here's a little crab apple from the one-legged blacksmith shop's house in Dolores, Colorado. It has a beautiful, tangy, raspberry-like flavor to it. This is one we call the Colorado Sunrise because it was growing out on County Road 28 miles from the Utah border, so that the sun had come up across Colorado before it got to the Colorado Sunrise. And because the apples on the tree are this beautiful blush with yellow and red, looking like a Colorado sunrise. By far the most popular apple, the best known apple ever to come from Colorado, was the Colorado Orange. This was a rootstock on Jesse Frazier's farm in Florence, Colorado, in which the graft had died, but because the rootstock was growing more or less in row, Jesse Frazier left it in place, meaning to regraft it. He didn't get around to regrafting it, and a few years later it started bearing beautiful fruit. Several years ago, we thought we had found this apple when a person in Canyon City told us of a tree that he had in his orchard. People in their 90s, back in the 90s, had told them that yes, this was a Colorado orange apple. When we did DNA testing on it, however, it came back as York Imperial, another long-keeping winter apple similar to the Colorado orange. It was easy to wonder if the Colorado orange apple had really existed or if it was something different, but we were sure that it was its own unique variety and not that the York had always been confused with the Colorado orange. On another trip to Canyon City, we went to another orchard where the person told us that they also had a Colorado orange apple. We submitted leaf samples from that tree, and unfortunately they came back Ben Davis. But then a couple of years later, we were back in that orchard in Canyon City again, and the person again took us out to the tree that they thought was a Colorado orange. This time they took us to a slightly different place in the orchard and a slightly different tree. It's easy to get lost in the old orchards. When we looked at the tree, we knew that it couldn't be a Ben Davis by the bark on it, and as we looked at the last limb living on the tree, we saw apples still hanging on the tree, orange apples, and more apples in the grass below. And even though it was December, these apples were still firm and fresh and of good quality. We submitted leaf samples from this tree for DNA analysis, and the DNA came back unique unknown, meaning that there is no match to this tree in any known collection or database. Though we felt hopeful that this was in fact the elusive Colorado orange, we were cautious. We wanted to have another way of checking to see if it could possibly be it. And the best way to possibly check would be to have a horticultural specimen from another Colorado orange apple. The problem, of course, was that this apple was believed to be extinct. And if the tree is believed to be extinct, that means that there is not going to be another horticultural specimen. Through the years, we've done many research trips to the archives at Colorado State University. On one of those trips, we became aware of the presence of a wax apple collection done by Miss Miriam Palmer in the early 1900s. Miss Palmer was a world-class expert on aphids, but she was also an artist, and she began doing watercolors and then wax cast of the apples that she saw at the early Colorado County fairs. This apple collection, these wax apples, were in boxes. A few of them were in a display case there in the agricultural building, but most of them were tucked in boxes and hadn't been looked at in years. They were sitting on a professor's shelf, and he knew they were important, but he wasn't sure what to do with them. We alerted the archives there, Linda Meyer at the archives, about the presence of this collection and the professor about the archives and that they would probably be willing to take them. And fortunately for us all, the apple collection is now safely stored in the archives where it can be viewed and used as a research tool. Among the apples in the apple collection was a waxed cast of the Colorado orange. We were able to take samples from the apple tree in Canyon City and compare them with the waxed apple in the Miriam Palmer collection, the only known horticultural specimen of the Colorado orange apple. And though the apples from the tree were not yet ripe, a hard freeze was coming, so they had been picked early, they still matched anatomically to the waxed apple in the Miriam Palmer waxed apple collection. Over the years, we began to wonder what happened to the Colorado apple industry. Why don't we eat Colorado apples? If they were some of the best apples ever grown, if they could win international and national fairs, which they did, why don't we have a bigger apple economy here left in Colorado? Some of it we knew had to do with development and insect pressure, with codling moths destroying the crops for apple trees nearest cities on the Front Range, which in turn caused the value of the land to be worth more for development than it was for orchards. But that didn't explain everything. We knew there was this great diversification that had been grown there, and we knew that it was not there anymore. What happened to it? There's the oft-repeated myth that the cider orchards were all cut out because of prohibition and that these apples were all for cider, but that wasn't the truth. There's no documentable evidence of an orchard ever being removed in Colorado because of prohibition. We also know that the main purpose of these older orchards was not cider. The Colorado cider industry is at its biggest point now in history. There's no evidence of a large, robust cider industry in Colorado in the old days. So, what happened to these trees? The answer was ultimately right beneath our nose. Starting in the late 1800s, the trend worked from many diverse orchards to orchards with just a few cultivars in them. As people moved away from their farms and produce was shipped further and further away, all of the subtleties of summer apples and winter apples and fall apples was lost. What most consumers wanted was a shiny red apple. So in the process, a lot of these older varieties were either removed or they were top worked. In other words, a new variety was put onto the older tree. Here's a plum cider grafted onto it that a Rome Beauty was top worked onto it. Here's an early harvest tree that another Rome was grafted onto. And here in an orchard in Montezuma County, an old wine sap tree was top worked with a delicious apple. Ironically, we now know that the wine sap was in fact one of the parents of the delicious apple. By about 1920, most orchards in Colorado were no longer being planted with a wide amount of diversity. Instead, they were mostly 3 different varieties of apples. Here's the Burrell Orchard north of Cortez with 320 acres and only 3 or 4 different varieties within all of those trees. These orchards became dominant for their commercial ability. They're old-fashioned delicious apples, highly prized and greatly marketable, favorites of people and growers for all of the sellable crops they produced. The Rome Beauty, a late flowering, late bearing apple that reliably bore fruit even on years when other trees wouldn't. And the Jonathan, an old apple that found repurpose in newer orchards, in these monocultural style orchards, through its ability to pollinate the delicious especially. These orchards from 1920 to about 1946, are big, beautiful Grand Park-like plantings. They're still planted on seedling rootstocks, so they grow big trees 20 to 30 feet tall and wide, well spaced at 25 by 25 foot spacing. But instead of the 20 or 30 or 50 varieties, they're down to just 3 or 4 varieties. The problem with this is when you have most of your orchard in just a few varieties and you're at altitude where you get irregular frosts, they are more prone to catastrophic freezing. In an orchard with a lot of different varieties, many of these varieties would still bear on any given year. Not so if they're all the same type and all freeze at the same time. These old Colorado apples are not just about our past, they're about our future. Colorado apple growers face steep competition from growers both abroad and domestically. Apple growers in South America have a greater ability to get their Fuji and Gala apples into grocery stores in Colorado than do growers in Cedar Ridge and Paonia. Growers in Washington state are set to dump 20 million bushels of Cosmic Crisp apples into the market per year. Colorado is known for exceptional quality fruit, the most beautiful and flavorful fruit. Old Colorado apples and the stories that they tell give our apple growers the opportunity to provide heirloom fruit at a time when consumer interest in locally grown and heritage foods have proven to be persistent market forces. For home fruit enthusiasts, the historic cultivars represent seasonality and tastes not found in store bins. To get these apples to consumers, we must have the trees available to growers, which is difficult because some of these cultivars are down to the last known tree standing. Initially, we propagate a second tree through grafting. Morp's first genetic bank for these clones is the historic Gold Medal Orchard in Macomo Canyon. Working with Colorado State University, Morp has planted many rare cultivars in CSU trial orchards at Rogers Mesa in Delta County and at Yellow Jacket in Montezuma County. These plantings give growers access to fruit for evaluation and scionwood for propagation. The recently planted Dolores Heritage Community Orchard is intended to tell the story of Colorado apples, serve as a classroom for orchard care, and be an egg tourism portal linking consumers to cider tasting, you-pick orchards, and fruit stands. We see this as the first of a series of conservation orchards across Colorado. Another important aspect for conservation is returning a new graft to the site of the original tree. If the mother tree has lived on that spot for well over 100 years, you can bet that the location is favorable for apple trees. Sometimes these occasions are sorrowful, a person too bedridden to come out but insisted on the tree being planted. Oftentimes these are joyous events reminding us of how people and trees grow together over time, an affirmation of continuum that life will keep going long after we are all gone. Some years back, we were at an old orchard west of Cortez, and the young couple there, taking care of the orchard, looked out at it and asked us if the apples were safe to eat. It's not that they had been sprayed in years or decades even, it's just that they didn't have barcodes on them. We now have orchards in the 7 elementary schools in the Cortez School District. There's an orchard in Southwest Open High and Battle Rock Charter School, and a 70-tree orchard in the Cortez Middle School. Kids growing up in Montezuma County now know that you can take an apple from a tree and eat it. We also teach grafting classes to adults. There's plenty of people in rural Colorado that have the land and the water for orchards if they had the skill to graft and start their own. What has been the final piece of the puzzle for Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project, the final thing needed to both long-term preserve the genetics that we have found growing across Colorado and to rebuild our fruit economy, was the location. In 2020, with great help from our partners, the Nature Conservancy, MORP was able to purchase the new MORP Orchard Hub property in Montezuma County, north of Cortez. This place will give us the ground for long-term plantings of preservation orchards to preserve the rare genetics into perpetuity. It will give us the space for a packing shed so that apples can come in and be processed and sorted and stored rather than just falling to the ground unused. It'll give classroom space to teach how to do orchards, how to grow orchards and orchard culture, how to graft and prune and harvest and sort fruit and process fruit, and how to conserve water while doing it. We feel that orchards can be a part of rural Colorado 100 years from now, but our best bet in doing that is preserving both these old rare genetics and the water resources needed to keep them growing. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation of Old Colorado apples. You can find more information at www.montezumaorchard.org.